behalf of the African Union for Housing Finance and for Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa, welcome everybody to this digital launch of the yearbook. I would like to observe that this is the 13th yearbook that's come out, and having been around for many of them, I think you can agree with me that we've seen a steady improvement over the years. The quality of the yearbook, the quality of the data that is used, and consequently the outcome, the content of it, and most important, its relevance to us in the affordable housing space throughout the continent, as well as for us involved in policy and in production, the delivery of housing on the ground. And so I'd like to extend a word of congratulations to Alison and her team, including all the contributors throughout the continent. It is a fairly large team. Roland is with us here today, but there are many others. And with that, hand over to Alison and say, tell us about this year's yearbook and what have been the main issues that you'd like to draw to our attention. So thank you, Alison, and over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Let's see, I'm just going to share my screen here. Here we go. Okay.
There we go.
You can see the screen, I hope.
Yes, we can.
Okay, let me just put it on full screen here. There we go. Okay, super. Thanks very much for the opportunity. As Paul said, my name is Alison Changana. I'm with the Center for Affordable Housing Finance, the Secretariat to the AUHF, and I am responsible as the head of research for the production of the yearbook each year, which, as Paul said, is now in its 13th edition. The yearbook is available in French and in English and is entirely available online. So as you're listening, you can go to CAF's website, and right at the top, you can download the entire yearbook or each of the country profiles separately. So please do have a look. It's all available and right there for your download. I want to first acknowledge, just as Paul said, we have a number of authors on the call, which is fantastic. And I'll tell you a little bit about the community that puts together the yearbook. But I mostly want to acknowledge Susan Carey, who is also in the virtual room, who is essentially our project manager and profile editor. And it's the magician behind all of this, all the workings and the gears that make this happen and pull it together. So the yearbook is the flagship publication of CAF. And sorry, I'm just reducing that. So what it does is it provides an overview of the housing and housing finance sectors in each country. So we cover 54 countries plus the Western Sahara. And there's a 4-page summary or profile of each country in the yearbook that's updated every single year. Now, the important thing about this publication is that we don't sit in Johannesburg and write about Madagascar and the Western Sahara or Libya or anywhere. We pull together an entire network of authors from across the continent and really across the globe. So we have 63 contributing authors this year. Some of the profiles were co-authored, and some of the profiles, some authors write for more than one profile. We try to find authors who are located in country. That is the preference, and in most cases, we're able to do so. And they can then collect data on the ground, which makes this far more credible, and provide a much better sense of what's happening in the last year and what's top of the agenda in the sector. We also rely upon 17 external editors that we appoint. So every single profile goes through a multi-stage process to check the facts, check the data, improve the writing, improve the flow, and make sure that we have a really strong piece to put together. So we began in 2010 with 15 countries, but as I said, we now cover the entire continent. And in terms of the French edition, the entire yearbook is also available in French, the individual profiles as well as the entire publication. And this, I think, is the 7th year that we've been producing the publication in French as well. And I think an important point to note is that we've now created a publication that is truly bilingual, in the sense that some of the profiles are written originally in French and translated into English, and some of the profiles are written originally in English and translated into French. So it's not a production of one in English and then just a copy into French. So in terms of the data collection that underpins the yearbook, the data collection process is, of course, run annually in July and August of each year. And it's part of a larger campaign that CAF is running, which is to build up the data infrastructure for the housing finance market across the continent. So it's a recognition that one of the key pillars of the market is the information itself that is available to investors and financiers and developers, et cetera. So we see our contribution to shoring up that data infrastructure as an important one. So what we do is, with the yearbook, each of the yearbook authors is asked to complete a data survey, which has this year it had 37 quantitative indicators and 6 qualitative ones. So we send the yearbook authors out with a checklist. Please find out the number of outstanding mortgages in Botswana this year. And so we get updated information as much as possible every single year. And that's one of the reasons that this yearbook is such a unique publication. There's no other document that does this. Just recently, in the last few years, what we've done is we've tried to pick a particular theme to concentrate on each year. And given the climate conference in Egypt in November, and the importance of the issue, we chose climate change this year, green issues and housing, as our theme and our lens that we used for looking at the sectors in each of the countries. So each country profile has the regular overview of the sector, but it also pays particular attention to green issues in housing and the impact of climate change on housing and affordable housing in particular. So in particular, what we've seen in terms of across all of the countries, we saw that there's an unprecedented number of climate emergencies that are hitting this continent. So the climate shock to African countries is the largest of other continents. So it's a combination of storms and droughts and wildfires. But you can see just this graph on the top that runs from 1980 up to 2021. And you can see the number of climate events just slowly, steadily climbing. So what we did this year in the yearbook then is we wanted to get a better sense of climate and what was happening. So we added to our survey a number of indicators around climate. So for instance, we looked at one of the indicators that we used was the percent of land that is within 5 meters of sea level, right? And of course, this would be an indicator of vulnerability of the country to tsunamis and to other cataclysmic events. And what the data was showing overwhelmingly is that the vulnerability to climate change is disproportionately impacting low-income households. And I think that's probably not news to any of us, but it's important to see that that's backed up by the evidence that we're seeing across African countries, that it's low-income households that are feeling the brunt of drought, of extreme temperatures, of floods, of wildfires. And that impact is devastating. So it's heavy rainfall and sea level rise. So households that are located particularly near the beach, near the coast, will be impacted. It's the damage of floods to houses, and then the impact this has on access to clean water. So it's not just about accommodation, but access to basic services. There's also the damage to agricultural productivity, which is important, and the increased health risks. And then, of course, on a very practical level, the cost of rebuild after a disaster is substantial. relief and reconstruction costs are sizable and are often crippling for an economy. So in terms of thinking about this a little bit more carefully, I think one of the key things that we realized as we started looking through the information in this yearbook is that there's a really important link between climate change and urbanization. So we've been talking in the yearbook for a number of years about urbanization in Africa and how it impacts on the housing sector. Okay. Now, the link with climate change is critical. So if you have a number of climate events, whether it's flooding, droughts, declining crop productivity, what happens is if households are not resilient and aren't able to bounce back from that event, then because of their reduced livelihood, they're often pushed into the cities in order to access economic opportunities. So perhaps they were farmers, but now the area is flooded and they're not able to rebuild. And so they move into the city. Now we know as part of the urbanization process that if cities are not able to plan for that influx adequately in terms of adequate housing, then we're going to see an increased number of informal settlements in cities. Now, a number of countries in Africa we saw have responded with strategies. So we're not starting with nothing. And many of the African countries have come up with strategies to reduce emissions, to look at renewable energy, and to think about disaster risk. But the issue that we were seeing throughout the profiles was that although countries were thinking about this and starting to get their heads around it, they hadn't gone so far as to apply that thinking to the housing sector specifically, or to affordable housing. So we were starting the thinking on climate change, but we hadn't done the extra step to think about what directly does it mean for this sector. So in terms of climate change, when we conceptualize this, we realize that really you're talking about a two-way relationship. So it's not just about the impact of floods on houses, but it's also about thinking about the impact of housing and the housing sector, construction, housing finance, on the environment, right? So it runs both ways. The impact of housing on the environment, we're going to see largely in the carbon footprint of the construction sector. So the construction sector is one of the largest contributors in terms of carbon emissions. And then if you're thinking about housing management, not just construction, so the process of once you've moved into the house, the maintenance, et cetera, then the impact of the carbon footprint is significant if you're not using energy efficient systems within the household. So issues of water efficiency and waste management are also significant in their contribution to the impact on the environment. Now, if we look at the other direction, the impact of the environment on housing and households, this is a little bit obviously more straightforward. Weather events will affect the construction process, delay the construction process, damage materials, et cetera. And environmental related demands on housing design as well. So we've seen thinking about climate change and thinking about the need for energy efficiency has affected how we build houses, how we design them, how we think about them, where we put them. And then in terms of housing management and maintenance, we need to be thinking about climate risks in terms of the vulnerability of the structure to extreme weather events, and air pollution levels would be another example. So the air pollution levels, obviously in a particular area, are going to impact upon the health of households. So in the sector, one of the key tools that's emerged and that you're likely familiar with is the EDGE tool that was created by the IFC. And the EDGE tool it's essentially a standard. It's a standard of compliance to green building. And in order to be certified to be EDGE certified, a building needs to demonstrate a 20% reduction in energy consumption and water use. So if it can demonstrate that, it can achieve EDGE certification. And what we've done in the yearbook is we used that indicator as one of our signposts for learning about where a country stood in respect to green issues. So in our key figures for each of the country profiles, we list the number of EDGE certified projects that are in that country. Now, in the majority of African countries, there are no EDGE certified projects at this point. So it's a new system, and it hasn't been upscaled significantly. But we do see projects that are EDGE certified in Ghana and South Africa, in Senegal and in Kenya in particular. But across the continent, it's essentially 30 or so. So it's a very small smattering of EDGE certified projects to date. But we do have the tool and the framework for building that up. So when we looked then at the data that was available, we saw that investors are increasingly thinking about environmental concerns when they make their investment choices. So they're asking the questions about, are these green buildings, before they decide to invest in a particular project. And as a result of that, the primary motivation for developers to build green and to go ahead and get their EDGE certification is that they want to access capital. So the housing finance sector is creating an incentive framework for green building. And that's a really important thing to understand. Nevertheless, the data for investors to use this indicator to make decisions is still too scarce. So what we need are more standards and metrics that are adapted to local conditions. So adapted to Africa. You know, the standards for understanding green building in Europe will be very different than understanding it in Lagos. So there's a need for us to adapt those metrics and standards to think about what they mean in the context of this continent. And one of the examples of where we need to adapt is that we know that in Africa, most buildings, most residential buildings are built incrementally, right? They're built piece by piece. And so we need to think about ways of assessing green building standards that allow for the fact that a house won't be built all in one shot. It will be built piece by piece, but there must be a way to measure its impact on the environment as one goes along. So thinking about that relationship, we framed it again in that familiar triangle of reduce, reuse, recycle that we see throughout the environmental sector. So we tried to think about ways that the housing sector can reduce, can reuse, and recycle. And I think one of the first things to talk about is the construction sector is a significant contributor. So that's a really important starting point, but it's not the only place to look when we think about touch points between green issues and housing. We need to go beyond the construction sector, beyond just the construction point in the value chain, and think about all the different steps in the value chain and how they relate to the environment and climate change along the way. So for example, if we're going to reduce the impact of housing on the environment, there's a number of examples of how we saw countries doing that this year in the profiles. So for instance, building methods and materials is a key way to think about modifying our behavior in construction in order to have less of an impact on the environment. So lightweight steel, for example, or energy saving devices that can be installed into houses to reduce energy use. So heat pumps, solar, water reduction, shower heads, etc. Land efficiency is another way that the housing sector can reduce its impact. So if we densify, instead of spreading development across open areas and green fields, then we're making sure that as a city settlement, we're more efficient in terms of our energy use, public transport costs, etc. And then another key question to think about is the extent to which countries are importing their building materials and the finishes for houses. And we saw that in a number of countries, it's very high reliance on imported materials. And we've always talked about that in the past because it impacts on affordability and hikes up affordability and vulnerability of affordability to external changes, inflation and currency risk and such. But it also seriously increases the carbon footprint. If we're flying in material for every single house, then the carbon footprint is much more substantial. So importation also affects affordability in terms of global supply chains. And we of course saw that this year, particularly in terms of inflation. So the example here in this graph is around cement prices, which we saw in some countries are staying fairly steady. So Cote d'Ivoire is an example there. But in Malawi, we were seeing significant variation in cement prices. And part of that is due to importation. How can the housing sector reuse? What would reuse mean in the context of the housing sector? So one way that we can reuse buildings is to renovate or refurbish them. So if we have old buildings in the inner city, we can make use of that embedded carbon footprint by renovating and refurbishing those for affordable rental, for instance. Another way that we can reuse buildings, you could put it this way, is that if we make sure that the quality is there, then the house can be used for longer. We increase its longevity, which means we need to reduce the number of houses we essentially need to build, right? Because we don't need to replace it as quickly. And here you see the issues that in a number of countries around enforcement of building codes. And Turkey, of course, doesn't fall within Africa, but this is a good example of where we've seen building codes not being sufficiently enforced, and as a result, increased vulnerability to earthquakes and death as a result of that. So I think another vector here would be unfinished buildings and housing finance products to support them. So an example that was in the Zambia profile was Zambia Home Loans, which is currently offering finance to complete unfinished buildings. We see a lot of unfinished residential buildings throughout the continent. And Zambia Home Loans said, let's tailor a housing product, finance product, particularly for this. So you can come and borrow money so that you can add on that extra room or complete the roof. And then the other final point then is that the resale market, in some senses, you could see as a means of reusing housing. Right? So instead of putting families in new houses all the time, we're using the filtering system within the property market to reuse assets and thus reduce our footprint. We can also think about recycling in the context of the housing sector. So obviously we can use recycled materials, but there's also the opportunity to convert buildings. There's a lot of opportunity for that within inner city areas. We can also think really about the use of space. So the importance of choosing well-located land and then thinking about the impact that that will have on household behavior. So one of the things that we realized as we were thinking through these issues was that we really, when we consider the impact on the environment, we don't have a metric for measuring the savings that come when a household is well located. So if we build a block of flats that's close to schools and close to jobs, and the family can walk to those areas, then we've reduced the carbon footprint of that family, because they don't need to get into a bus, they don't need to get into their car and spend an hour on the highway or anything along any of that kind of commuting. So we need to think about metrics that recognize that where we build is a means of impacting behavior and then reducing our carbon footprint. So then if we think about the relationship between green and affordability, a number of you will be familiar with the indicator that CAF collects every year, which is the cheapest newly built house. So we ask yearbook authors to phone up 3 or 4 private developers, private affordable housing developers who work in urban areas. And we ask them, what's the cheapest house, new house that you've put on the market this year? A house that's actually available. So not theoretically or planned or in the works, but one that's on the market right now, the cheapest newly built house in an urban area by a private developer. And the purpose of this indicator is to think about what the private sector is delivering without government support. Now, this year, when we asked that question, we found that the cheapest newly built house was the same answer that we've had for the last 2 years, which was a house built by the Millard Fuller Foundation outside Abuja by the Family Homes Fund. And that comes at around $9,390 at the exchange rates today. So that seems to be the lowest threshold that we're seeing across the continent. But we don't have data on to what extent that house is green, or to what extent where that house, for instance, is located. If I pay $9,391, am I then going to end up spending extra money commuting and increasing my carbon footprint? Because the way that that affordable unit was achieved and the affordability was achieved was by locating it on the outskirts of the city. So the relationship between these is really important to think about as well. Also, when we think about affordability, we did something new in the yearbook this year. We tried to experiment with another approach of looking at affordability. So previously we used data from CGIT, from the Economics Intelligence Unit, on income levels in each country. But that data is actually no longer available. It's been taken off the market, so to speak. And so there isn't a similar source of data globally and for African countries on income levels, so the number of households at each income segment. So we decided to do something entirely different. We asked our yearbook authors, what would be a typical monthly salary for a police officer and for a teacher? So we didn't ask them, this isn't a scientific survey, employment survey. So this isn't a comprehensive piece of information about what law enforcement officers make in Zambia. What it is a representation of, it's very likely that you could have a police officer in Zambia who makes 470,000 shillings a month. So with those typical levels of income, we then asked if that person and that household was going to access a bond at the prevailing conditions within that country, so the common interest rate, loan to value ratio, what's the cost of the house, the price of the house that they could afford to purchase? So for instance, in Uganda, a teacher may be making 500,000 shillings a month. At that level of income, they could only afford a house, which is 9.5 million shillings. So the next question is, how does that relate to the cheapest newly built house? Is it above or below? And the answer that you can see in this graph is that in nearly all the cases, what a police officer and a teacher can afford is way below the cost of a cheapest newly built house. So the red bars here are the cost of the cheapest newly built house, and the dark blue and the light blue are what a teacher, a typical teacher, would be able to afford. And you can see that there's a significant gap, except for a few countries. So Cote d'Ivoire, Lesotho, Botswana. But on the whole, what we're seeing is that there's an affordability gap that's significant, which suggests a couple things. We could think about reducing the cost of the newly built house. Is that possible? Can we go any further down? It may mean that we need to think about promoting and supporting the rental market as an alternative to ownership. Or it may mean that we need to think about reusing existing housing in the sense of supporting the functioning and the inclusive functioning of the resale market. So just as the last slide here, I think as a summary, we saw that the 2022 yearbook is definitely giving evidence of an impact of climate change on housing at each step of the value chain, as well as the impact of housing on climate change, so the opposite, at each step of the value chain. So we're seeing that relationship in land and infrastructure. We're seeing it certainly in construction. So we talked about importation of construction materials as an example, and of energy efficiency metrics for building codes. It also impacts on the sales and rental step in the value chain. So that's where the availability of green finance comes in and of green mortgages. And then, of course, the overall enabling environment is another context. So we're seeing, I think, increasingly climate and sustainability issues as part of the national affordable housing discussion. So it comes into the room as one of the factors. I don't think it's sufficiently there yet, but it's starting to enter the room and to come onto our radar as something to think about when we're talking about affordable housing. And I think, just to wrap up, I think the key point that we saw evidence of within the yearbook, and that became really a theme of the AUHF conference in November, was that building green is not an add-on to an affordable house. It's not a bonus. It's a necessity in order to make it affordable over the long term. So I think, Paul, I will stop there, and we can have an input, I think, from Roland and open it up for discussion. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alison, and for that comprehensive overview. Very, very interesting. Just to the audience, we're going to have an input by Roland on the Nigerian component of the report, and then we're going to have about 15 minutes of Q&A. And can I ask that if you do have questions, you just fill them in the Q&A section below, so that we can sort of go through them and see whether we can't get them together in one or other theme. And then there'll be a few closing remarks, and we should be done by the end of the hour. So Roland, over to you. Roland will give us a five-minute overview of his work as a contributor. And then let's just note all the contributors there, all 63 of them. Over to you, Roland.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much, Alison. I think for us in Nigeria, over the last, I would say, 5 years, the work that we have been doing and that CAF has been doing in terms of collecting data has really impacted the market. So you would find out that we were in an ecosystem where data was becoming a challenge. And I think that what CAF has done with the yearbook in terms of getting the owners of the data to be actively involved is something that has helped a lot. And I would say that in terms of gain, so for example, let me just reiterate that. So for example, today it is easy, very easy to get into the institutions who are members of the AUHF to be able to get data on what's happening within the organization and in the market in general. And so what this has also done is that we are now moving towards a whole lot of data transparency and the willingness to give data, although there's still a lot that needs to be done. But just comparing the work that we're doing today versus the work that we're doing in the country 5-7 years ago, you would see that the yearbook has played significant roles, you know, in terms of even bringing stakeholders together to begin to look at data points. So for example, now it is easier. NMRC has, within this period that the CAF is doing the yearbook, set up somewhat of a housing information market portal where you can go to and then really get information in the housing market in Nigeria. And even for us in collecting data, like I said, this year was a bit different because again, we've had the participating institutions help a lot. But when it came to collecting data on climate, for example, it was difficult because we didn't really have any of the institutions involved with CAF doing a lot around the climate change and the impact. But in terms of green, I think the example that Alison gave in her presentation comes to mind, because to say that what we hear from developers, even though the edge is trying to serve as an incentive for people to come on, but what we're hearing from developers is that the cost outlay, the initial cost outlay for doing green building is heavy, and nobody's really willing to take that up. And the example you gave, Alice, in terms of looking at the family homes project that they did with MFF, the Muller Foundation, you know, if we have, although I don't have the data of how many people comes from Nasarawa, where the project is located, to Abuja for work, but that immediately throws green, the idea of green, into some sort of chaos, because I think recently we learned that they were awarded the EDGE certification for green, which is a very good thing. But if more than 50% of the people are traveling to work, then all of that footprint and carbon emissions will be a different ballgame. So in summary, really, we've seen the work with CAF and the work with the yearbook that's helping the market a lot. Now we have a lot of independent developers who want to understand the market. That's their first point of call, to just understand what the affordability dimensions are in the country in terms of housing. So I think I'll just stop for now, and then if there are, just to make sure we're on time, and then if there are questions, I can take questions as the program continues. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Roland. Very interesting. We're now at Q&A time, and if you either just raise your hand or preferably write it in the Q&A section, we'd appreciate it. We've got two questions thus far. One is actually in the chat, but the one from Richard Olubameru, my apologies, Richard. How well have we been able to research into the best and cheapest technology of producing affordable houses in Africa? And Alison or Roland, do you have a comment on that?
Okay.
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead. Roland.
Go ahead,
no,
Roland.
Go ahead, Alison. I was just going to say, what I was going to point out from what I've learned within the region is that as of today, I'm not sure there is a dedicated research that I've come across in terms of building technology in Africa. Now, I would think that it's not just about the best and cheapest technology of producing affordable houses. It is whether that cheapest and best, you know, have a high level of acculturation with the people who want to use it. I.e., if there's a technology that works very well in somewhere in Namibia, okay, can I bring it to Nigeria? And even if I bring it to Nigeria, will Nigerians use it because of the existing cultures and perception about alternative building technology? So, but again, I just said that to bring out that point, but I don't think I've seen any within Africa, apart from precast, which is concrete technology. I don't know whether that's green today. I don't think I've seen any, but I'll leave it to Alice. I mean, she covers more area within the continent. Yeah, thank you.
Roland, I think that's an important point. We certainly see resistance to alternative technologies here in South Africa, but over to you, Alison.
I think that we're starting to collect information about this, about affordable technology. And we have a few examples, and we're trying to look into those innovation cases. And the profiles do have a number of examples. I think one would be 3D printing. And I believe you can put in the link, perhaps, Tandiwe, but we do have a blog on CAF's website about that process. And Roland, that's a good example, because I think one of the cons in terms of 3D printing is acceptance by households and by communities of what the end product house actually looks like and how it feels and how it fits in. So that would be one of the technologies, but there are a number of others, but I think the need for collecting information around that is significant. And there's a lot of space for improvement on that data. Did you want to add anything, Tandiwe? You might have examples.
Tandiwe, you're on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. No, I think you've really covered most of the points, Alison and Roland there, and Paul as well. I think one of the technologies that we have seen in some of the debates has been from easy housing concept, which is mostly the timber that they are incorporating. And there is a call for maybe exploring some initiatives like bamboo and clay. There is also some initiatives that are coming from AUHF Rwanda. They are trying to focus a little bit more on green. So I'll post in a few links so that people can explore more and just see what else is there. But I agree with you, Roland, there is no research or a document that perhaps it would be useful to have one blog or document to gather up all that is available and more on building technology in Africa.
Thank you, Tandiwe. Just as a closing remark on that, I imagine that the question says, what is the best and cheapest technology? And often there would be new technologies we would need to research, but also better ways of using existing technologies, which could add to that discussion. We have a question or an observation in the chat, and I don't know whether Alison or Roland or even Tandiwe, you'd like to pick it up, mentioning that the critical importance of access to water, sanitation, and solid waste as part of this equation. I think the author made the point that that perhaps this was even more critical than the housing question. I assume people have houses, and then what would your comment be on water, sanitation, and solid waste as part of this critical a critical part of this equation? Alison, let's start with you this time, and then
so we're asking around the role of water.
Well, access to water, sanitation, and solid waste. I mean, particularly in informal settlements and those kind of things, I assume. Mark, if you've got anything you'd like to add to your observation, we'd appreciate it. Go for it, Alison.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've been thinking about at CAF is when we quantify the backlog or the housing need, we usually speak to inadequate housing, and we include in that so-called slums or informal settlements. I think one of the things that we need to think about is that in many of the cases, housing is inadequate, but it doesn't necessarily require a household to move to an entirely new house. That what is missing is one or more elements, key elements of perhaps the structure and safety, or access to basic services, which would be a key example. So proper sanitation system, access to clean water, et cetera. I mean, if we're looking at informal settlements, I think what we often see is a communal use of water taps or access to basic services. And the question then becomes, if we have 40 households that are using 4 toilets, can we count that as adequate housing, even though there is access to sanitation? So there's a question of quality and degree, I think, in terms of access that we also need to consider. But yes, absolutely a key element of affordability and of thinking about adequacy in housing and shelter.
Good. Any other comments on that answer? I thought that was.
Yeah, I think that basically covered from my end. Yeah.
Super. And then the last question we have is, what is the major supply determinant of affordable housing provision? Is it the building cost, land cost, or generally, or something else in our continent in Africa? What is the major slide? Yeah, go for it,
very
Alison.
well suited to answer that, which is exciting. Tandiwe, will you let me share very quickly? Can you see the screen?
Yep.
So CAF did a study on this a few years ago. We haven't updated it since about 2016, 2017, but we looked at a whole number of countries and looked at 2 cities, major cities within each country, and asked the question about the components. What was the cost of building the house when we break it down between labor and compliance costs and land and building materials, for example. And all of this data is available on our website. We can put the link in the chat, but we have a dashboard that allows you to look at any particular country and then to drill down and to see what were the major contributors to the cost. So this is just an overview graph, and you can see very clearly that it's the red that dominates, and that's the construction costs. And that was the situation in most of the countries, but it does vary considerably. So in some countries, like the example was in Nairobi in Kenya, the land costs are significant, as well as in Kampala. And in some places, the infrastructure costs, like in Malawi, take up a much larger portion of the total cost of the unit as well. So all of this data, as I said, is available on our website that you can play around with in the dashboard. And there's also an underlying paper that lays it out and discusses this issue. So I think the short answer is it varies between countries, but on the whole, it's largely the construction costs, which is the major component.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alison. Anything you'd like to add, Roland or Tandiwe?
Oh, no, I'm good from my end. I'm
Good.
good from my end, yeah.
Thank you. Any last questions that anybody would like to pose to the panel? Brilliant. So it serves for me to make some closing remarks. I've really only got 3 closing remarks. But I think the Center for Affordable Housing Finance in Africa and its data agenda is really, really critical for us as practitioners in housing throughout the continent. There's that old saying that if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And it's very, very important that we oh, all right. There are 2, sorry, let me finish my point and then I'll go back to 2 raised hands and a question. So thank you for bringing those in, guys. So the importance of data to provide us guidance in what our policy objectives should be, what should be the physical impact on the ground, the practice that we do in developing housing, and particularly affordability as core to that. Let's start with the raised hands. I believe there are 2 raised hands. I can't see them. Mark Briley, would you start, please?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, I think the most important thing we need to do about informal settlements, and in Durban we have 585 informal settlements at our latest count, and over 250,000 people living there. The most important thing to deliver is water and sewage. That is what is the most important thing. We'll get there with housing over time, but water and sewage is the most important thing to improve the quality of life of people living in such circumstances. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. I think it was your comment on the chat group that we discussed earlier. Let's just pick up the next. Erica, could you ask your question or make your observation? And you're on mute, I see, so if you wouldn't mind unmuting.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go for it.
My question really, I put it in the chat as well. It was just whether the research, and possibly you've addressed it, but whether the research has also looked at initiatives that reduce the cost of infrastructure and housing, where it actually, the main focus is environmental improvement. So an example of where people are helping communities, or communities are gathering plastic waste, and that gets reworked into aggregate and into cement blocks to be used again for housing and infrastructure.
Thank you, Erica. Any of the panelists like to pick up that comment or question?
Yes, so the use of those kinds of processes and innovations and technologies, that was one of the questions that we asked all of the yearbook authors. And you'll find in the yearbook a little box in each profile that tries to answer that question. I think although there are some cases that were highlighted, and the building bricks, for example, is one of the ones that comes out there. On the whole, there isn't that much data on that kind of thing. I think that was the main finding that we were seeing in the yearbook. We were asking those questions and a lot of the authors were coming back and saying, I couldn't find much. So there's a real gap there and a need for more information and more understanding.
Okay, thank you.
Super, thank you.
Okay, I think let me just quickly also make a general comment, Paul. I think the part of construction things, maybe this is what Alison, maybe this is something that you might want to start to look at outside of the yearbook. It appears that there are a lot of questions, unanswered questions around construction technology, green buildings, and alternative technology. So, I mean, also just looking at the questions in the chat room and what people are saying, I think it might just be a general comment to, want to try and look at that. Just the way you guys looked at the construction costs and dimensioning construction costs. I think it might be a good time to start to look at what construction technology works, what acceptability is, the different types and all of that. I just thought I should mention that as we wrap up.
And I think that's opposite, Roland, simply because the next question from Luanga is, I'd like to know if research has been carried out on the use of interblocking soil stabilized blocks and the effectiveness of as a technology construction. And I think let's, what I was remarking at is that that's probably quite specific research and certainly wouldn't have been undertaken in the ambit of the yearbook. Yeah.
Correct.
Okay. But I think it's going to be Luanga. I don't think we can answer that question right now, but it's certainly within the context of what Roland's just said. It's something I think CAF and AUHF should start looking into. It is a very, very broad topic, I might add. Right. Any last question or comment that anybody would like to make? Mark, go for it. Mark, I
got to unmute. Can you hear me now?
I can. Go for it.
Okay. Basically, basic cement mix. For the last question, a basic cement mix is 4 parts sand, 1 part cement, and enough water to make it stiff. If you make concrete, you put sand and you put stones in it. Now, for a housing construction, say in our traditional areas where we got rondavels, 1 in 10%, well, no, 10% of a mix with local good sand, got to be good sand, not clay sand and all those, but 1 in 10 of local sand will give a very substantial structure. Just to add that these are things that are affordable, doable, and just need the outreach to do it. So your normal cement mix, 1 in 4, and you dilute that 1 in 10 with a local good sand, and then you can build a structure from that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to take a last question from Landiwe Mahlangu because it moves us away from the technology question. And the question is, how do climate and sustainability considerations, how do they affect financing for affordable housing? Are we seeing a growing appetite for further curtailment from private financiers and banks? I mean, how how much appetite is there in the financial services sector, broadly speaking, for this kind of housing? And did we pick that up in the yearbook, and have we seen a trend, Alison or Roland?
I think we are seeing an increasing appetite, but there's again so much space for upscaling and rollout. But when that question is asked, Paul, I'm thinking of Tufts product as a good example that perhaps you want to just quickly speak to.
Well, I think I mean, I run a financial services company, a specialized financial services company that funds rental housing. And particularly in inner city areas where there's a lot of repurposing of existing buildings. And our product really is, how do we promote green in the construction and the repurposing, particularly around just two things, energy efficiency and water saving, and strive to actually beat the EDGE standards, taking it up to as much as 30%. And then the only other component that we also promote is that post-implementation monitoring. In other words, how well is the heat pump or whatever installation performing over time? I think it's starting to, in the development finance world, it's starting to gain traction. Right, guys, I'm going to then draw this to a close. Please do feel free to interact with the Centre for Affordable Housing Finance as a secretariat to AUHF. I just had two other points to make. I think the yearbook hit the spot on having a focus on climate and the impact of climate, and particularly, and I like the way it was put, was the climate impact on housing and vice versa, and particularly the former. How does climate and climate change impact the way we should be doing housing, and particularly to emphasize the point that Alison made, that building green is a necessity because it improves affordability. And we've certainly seen that in South Africa, and I think I'm glad to hear that it is more a continental-wide issue. I would make the point as my final point is that there does seem to be a confluence of a lot of policy positions. So the climate position is saying there's an importance in densification, and so is the local economic development position, and so is the inclusive growth and job creation and all the things that go with urban densification. So climate, employment, entrepreneur development, access, all those critically important components seem to be coming, that urban sprawl is something we should try and combat in our affordable housing policy positions and practice positions. And with that, just to thank our panelists, particularly Roland and Alison, to thank Tandiwe for putting this together, and I have to give a disclaimer, I'm the chair of the Centre for Affordable Housing Finance, but to give the congratulations to Alison and her team and to CAF for producing yet another and improved version of the previous. The quality is getting so good. I don't know how you're going to continue to keep improving it, but we thank you very much. And with that, can I hand back to Tandiwe and say thank you all for attending.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Alison and Roland and Beatrice, and for everyone for engaging in this particular discussion. Please keep any insights or comments coming in, info@housingfinanceafrica.org. I've pasted it in the chat, or info@auhf.co.za. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody. And thank you again.